By March 30, this war was already bigger than the first wave of strikes. It started on February 28 with attacks on Iran's leadership and military infrastructure. Now it sits on top of the Gulf's most sensitive energy corridor. More than 3,000 people have been killed. More than 300 U.S. troops have been wounded. And the Strait of Hormuz, the route that normally carries about 20% of globally traded oil and gas, is still effectively closed. The damage on paper is heavy. U.S. officials say more than 10,000 Iranian targets have been hit. They say more than 66% of Iran's missile, drone, naval production sites, and shipyards have been struck, and 92% of Iran's large naval vessels have been sunk. Those are big numbers, but they do not end the story. U.S. intelligence can confirm only about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal has actually been destroyed. Another third may be damaged or buried. The rest may still be usable. That gap matters because this fight has changed shape. At the start, it looked like a shock campaign meant to break Iran's command structure and tear open its military system. Now, the fight is also about who can keep pressure on the chain that runs from Kharg Island to Hormuz, and from Hormuz into the world market. Iran has lost real military capacity. Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strike, but Iran is still firing back, still threatening shipping, and still doing enough to keep the region off balance. So, the spine of the story is simple. Kharg is the export hinge. Hormuz is the artery. One converts oil into revenue. The other connects that revenue to the outside world. Pressure on one without pressure on the other would be painful. Pressure on both at once changes the terms of the war. This is no longer only a contest over destroyed targets. It is a contest over whether the system that keeps Iran economically alive and strategically relevant can still work under sustained attack. That is the fight now sitting underneath the headlines. Kharg Island sits at the center of Iran's export chain. Reuters has described it as handling around 90% of Iran's oil exports. That makes it more than a storage site, more than a loading point. It is where production turns into revenue. It is where oil becomes usable cash under wartime conditions. If that process slows, the effect does not stay on the island. It moves into state revenue, import capacity, budget pressure, and the wider question of how long Iran can keep absorbing punishment while still paying for war. That is what made the March 13 strike so important. U.S. forces hit military targets on Kharg and left the oil terminal itself untouched. The message was sharp without being total. Washington did not need to blow up the terminal to change the operating picture. It only needed to show that the island could be reached again. Reuters reported that Iran still moved roughly 1.1 million to 1.5 million barrels per day between February 28 and March 12, so the export mechanism was still alive. The problem for Tehran was different. The node had been exposed. It could still function, but it could no longer be treated as secure depth. That changes behavior fast. A hub like Kharg depends on regular loading, vessel access, insurance confidence, and the assumption that cargo can leave on time. Once that assumption breaks, pressure spreads before storage runs dry. Tankers wait, buyers hesitate, traders look elsewhere, insurers recalculate risk. Officials start asking how often the route can really stay open if the war goes on. The barrel may still exist. Getting it to market becomes slower, riskier, and more political. A functioning terminal is not the same thing as a trusted export corridor. For years, Iran's model rested on two things at once: the ability to threaten traffic in the Gulf, and the ability to keep selling its own oil through the same neighborhood. Kharg sat in the middle of the second part. Once the island became a live pressure point, the war stopped looking like a simple exchange of strikes. It became a fight over whether Iran could still turn oil, geography, and infrastructure into staying power. Kharg still stood. Its protected status did not. Kharg was one part of it. Hormuz was the other. Once the strait moved into prolonged disruption, the pressure spread past Iran's own exports and into the wider energy system. Reuters reported on March 30 that roughly 12 million barrels per day remain unavailable from the market under current conditions. That is not a small hole. It is the kind of supply gap that forces states, traders, and refiners to think in months instead of days. If that kind of disruption lasts, strategic reserves cannot smooth it over forever. Prices reacted like a market that no longer trusted the route. Reuters said Brent crude had jumped nearly 60% since the war began. AP put Brent near $116 a barrel on March 30, up sharply from around $70 before the war. European gas prices were up more than 70% since February 28. Diesel, jet fuel, gasoline, all of it started feeling strain. That is not just panic buying, it is the pricing of uncertainty into every downstream calculation tied to Gulf flow. The market was telling the same story the battlefield was telling, just in a different language. A corridor does not need to disappear to lose value. It just needs to stop feeling dependable. Once traders doubt that Gulf barrels will move on time, the rest follows. Tankers slow down, refiners trim runs, governments dust off contingency plans, buyers compete harder for replacement supply, shipping schedules lose rhythm, commercial confidence narrows long before inventories run out completely. The route remains visible on the map. Its reliability starts to drain away. Reuters reported that PetroChina said about 10% of its crude oil and natural gas supplies were tied to Hormuz, and that contingency planning was already in motion. That is the real signal. Large buyers do not talk that way when they expect a short disturbance. They talk that way when the corridor itself has become part of the battlefield. Kharg is the export hinge, Hormuz is the artery. Put both under stress at the same time, and the effect goes beyond cargo. It starts eating into war endurance, not just for Iran, but for every actor tied to Gulf energy. That endurance problem matters because Iran can still keep parts of the corridor unstable. Reuters reported on March 27 that U.S. Central Command said more than 10,000 targets had been struck. More than 66% of Iran's missile, drone, naval production sites, and shipyards had been hit, and 92% of Iran's large naval vessels had been sunk. Washington has used those numbers to argue the campaign is ahead of schedule and does not require U.S. ground troops inside Iran. There's real force behind that claim. The damage is large. The suppression effort is real. Iran has taken losses it cannot easily hide. But the same Reuters reporting also shows the limit. U.S. intelligence can confirm with certainty only about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal has been destroyed. Another third is believed to be damaged or buried. The rest may still be active. Reuters also said Iran still retains at least about 30% of its launch capacity through hardened underground facilities. That matters because it keeps a starving strike layer in play even after the first rounds of damage. A force does not need full volume to remain dangerous. It only needs enough surviving reach to keep imposing cost. So yes, the force has been cut down, sharply, but not erased. Iran's strike network survives in a narrower form. It cannot operate the way it could at the start of the war. It has less freedom, less volume, and less confidence. Still, it can impose cost. It can widen the battle space. It can keep shipping nervous and keep nearby states on alert. A reduced capability is not the same thing as a finished capability. Reuters reported on March 30 that Iran was still firing back across the region, while the wider conflict had spread to attacks linked to Hezbollah and the Houthis. That is enough to keep this campaign in the suppression phase, not the clean finish phase. Washington knows it too. Reuters also reported that thousands of additional U.S. troops have moved into the region to give President Trump more options if the war widens. A badly damaged capability is still a capability. That is why the corridor remains dangerous even after the headline strikes. Listen to how governments are talking now. On March 30, Reuters reported that President Trump again warned Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, while also saying talks were moving forward with what he called a more reasonable regime. That mix matters. Threat on one side, negotiation on the other. It does not sound like a government describing a settled battlefield. It sounds like a government trying to hold military pressure in place while looking for a political way to stop the damage from spreading further through the Gulf and into energy markets. The region sounds the same way. Reuters reported that Pakistan is preparing to host talks aimed at resolving the conflict. AP said Islamabad was positioning itself as a mediator after consultations involving Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. That is not what the map looks like when everyone thinks the outcome is settled. It is what the map looks like when the damage is already large and nobody wants the next round to spill wider. Mediation enters the picture when actors start thinking less about headlines and more about containment. That is where the war sits now. Not resolved, not frozen, managed, or at least being managed under pressure. Iran's public line points in the same direction, even if the tone is hostile. Reuters reported that Iranian officials denied any direct negotiations and accused Washington of using diplomacy as cover while moving more forces into the region. AP said confirmations from both sides remained incomplete and that Iranian rhetoric was still openly threatening toward U.S. troops, so the words are sharp. The underlying motion is defensive. Everyone is talking like the war can still get worse, because it can. No side is speaking like it trusts the next week to stay contained on its own, and the Gulf no longer feels like rear space. That may be the deepest change of all. Kharg is exposed. Hormuz is contested. Energy flows that used to sit quietly in the background now sit in the center of military and diplomatic calculation. The map did not move. Its meaning did. Once a region loses that sense of insulation, even normal traffic starts carrying strategic weight. Iran has not been removed from the board. That is too simple. The stronger conclusion is this. The war is now being fought under different terms. Iran's military system has been degraded. Its export chain has been exposed. Its leadership structure has been shaken. And the corridor connecting Gulf energy flows to the wider market no longer carries the same assumption of safety. What remains is a narrower and more dangerous contest over endurance, routing confidence, and how long each side can keep imposing cost on the other. That is the part strike footage does not fully show. Kharg still stands, but not as insulated export depth. Hormuz still exists, but not as a reliable commercial corridor under current conditions. Iran still has missile and drone capacity, but that capacity now operates under heavier suppression, lower confidence, and more political exposure. Physical survival is one thing, functional security is another. The same asset can remain visible while losing a large part of its operating value. 3 questions matter now. Can Gulf shipping recover enough confidence to normalize flows before market stress turns into a longer economic shock? Can Iran's surviving launch network keep imposing enough cost to stretch out the conflict? And can diplomacy narrow the war before the next wave of escalation spreads through proxies, partners, and more strike cycles? Reuters and AP reporting suggest all 3 questions were still open on March 30. A war can continue after its operating model has been damaged. It becomes harder to sustain, harder to control, and harder to contain, so the verdict is not peace. It is not total collapse either. The war is still active, the board is still open, but control over tempo no longer looks evenly shared. Iran can still threaten and disrupt. The United States and its allies can still strike deeper and hold more of the initiative. Fewer squares in the Gulf now feel secure, and once a war reaches that point, even the assets left standing do not carry the same value they had before. The shooting may slow at moments. The structural damage underneath it will take much longer to undo.